He said he was no one's father, but every night he'd sit by the fire, open the locket, and stare like he'd never stop. The firelight caught the worn silver, making it gleam like a tear in the dark. Red Garner's hands, gnarled and stained from a life of mending fences and breaking horses, were impossibly gentle as they held the small oval. His knuckles were mountains, his calluses were riverbeds of hardened skin, but they cradled the locket as if it were a living, breathing thing, a fragile bird's egg. He didn't look at it out in the open, not where the other hands could see. He waited until the bunkhouse was a chorus of snores and whiskey-slowed breathing, until the only light was the dying embers in the hearth. Then, and only then, would he retreat to the corner cot that had been his for 20 years and perform his ritual. The clasp was worn smooth, and it took a particular pressure from his thumbnail to spring it open. Inside, behind a scratched piece of isinglass, was the face of a little girl. She wasn't smiling, not quite. Her expression was one of serious contemplation, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle too big for her small head. She had his eyes, a deep and quiet blue that seemed to hold the vastness of the Montana sky. Her hair was the color of sun-bleached wheat, tied back with a ribbon that was barely a smudge in the faded photograph. He never touched the picture. His thumb would trace the rim of the locket, a slow, circular pilgrimage around her face. But he never dared to press against the image itself, afraid his touch might erase what little was left. He would sit there for an hour, sometimes more, just looking. The silence in the bunkhouse was a living thing, thick with the dreams and sorrows of other men. But in Red's corner, the silence was different. It was a hollowed-out space, a chapel built for one, and the girl in the locket was its only icon. He'd hear the wind moaning through the chinks in the log walls, a lonely sound that usually went unnoticed, but in these moments felt like a shared lament. He'd feel the cold seeping up from the floorboards, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a cold that lived in his bones, a permanent winter he'd carried since the day the locket came into his possession. The other men at Rattlestone Ranch knew him as a man of few words and fewer needs. He was Red, the one you went to when a post needed setting deep and true, or when a spooked mare needed a calm hand. He took his coffee black, his whiskey neat, and his solitude seriously. They'd see him staring into the distance sometimes, his gaze fixed on something beyond the jagged peaks of the Bridger Mountains, and they'd just let him be. Every man had his ghosts. Red's just seemed to walk closer to him than most. They'd asked him once, years ago, a new handful of nerve and liquor if he had any family. Red had just shaken his head, his eyes never leaving the fire. No, he'd said, and the word was flat and final, a stone dropped into a deep well. Never married, no one's father. The new hand had pressed, asking about the locket someone had seen him cleaning. Red's face had closed up like a fist. He hadn't said another word, just got up and walked out into the biting wind, and the subject was never raised again. The story became part of his legend, Red Garner, a man who'd sprung from the earth itself, with no past and no kin. But the locket told a different story. It whispered it to him every night in the dying firelight. It spoke of a love so fierce it had burned him down to the foundations, leaving nothing but this scorched and silent man. It spoke of a promise made and a promise broken. It spoke of a name he hadn't allowed himself to say aloud in 15 years. The face in the locket was a constant, searing reminder of the lie he lived. He was a father. He was. And the denial of it was a heavier burden than any saddle or bale of hay he'd ever lifted. He'd close the locket with a soft click that sounded like a lock turning in a door that would never be opened again. He'd slip the chain over his head, the cool metal a familiar weight against his chest, and tuck it beneath his long johns, where it rested against the scar. The scar was old, a pale, silvery crescent just over his heart. It was shaped like a cradle. He'd lie back on his cot, the straw mattress rustling beneath him, and close his eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. Not yet. First, he had to walk the long road back, through the years of dust and silence, to the place where the lie began. He had to see her mother's face, smell the sagebrush after a rain, and feel the phantom weight of a small hand in his. It was his penance, to remember everything and to say nothing. The days at Rattlestone were governed by the sun and the seasons, a rhythm that was both merciless and comforting. There was always something that needed fixing. A fence line down after a blizzard, a trough leaking, a barn roof threatening to give way under the weight of the snow. Red was good at fixing things. He had a patience for it, a way of seeing the break and knowing just how to mend it so it would hold. He found a strange solace in the work. You could see the progress. A sagging fence became a straight, taut line. A splintered gate swung true on its hinges. It was honest work, and it left no room for the ghosts that haunted his nights. He could lose himself in the simple, repetitive motions, the swing of the hammer, the pull of the saw, the steady rhythm of his own breathing. He worked alongside the other hands, men like him who had come to Rattlestone to outrun something, but their pasts were spoken of in loud, boisterous tales of bad luck and worse women. Red's past was a locked room. He offered them his labor, his skill, and his silence, and they, in turn, offered him the same. It was a fair trade. This particular spring, a new presence had been added to the ranch's quiet landscape. The foreman, a man named Elias Thorne, had brought his sister and her daughter to live with him after her husband had died of a fever back east. The sister, a frail, nervous woman named Clara, kept to the main house, but her daughter, Bertie, was another matter entirely. She was 8 years old, with a tangle of dark curls and eyes that missed nothing. She was a small whirlwind of curiosity in a world of quiet men. She followed them around, her questions a constant stream. Why do you call that horse old Satan? How come the sky is so much bigger here? Can a coyote really cry? The men were mostly amused by her. She was a splash of bright color in their monochrome world. They'd answer her questions with gruff patience, whittle her small toys from scraps of wood, and let her tag along as they did their chores. All of them, except Red. He kept his distance. When Bertie approached, he would find a reason to be somewhere else. Her presence was like a stone in his shoe, a constant irritating pressure. It wasn't that he disliked the child. It was that she was a child. Her laughter, her quick, darting movements, the very fact of her smallness, it all scraped against a wound he kept hidden from the world. One afternoon, Red was in the barn, repairing a harness. The air was thick with the smell of hay, leather, and dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight, slanting through the high windows. It was quiet, the kind of deep, peaceful quiet that only an old barn can hold. He was so lost in his work, in the methodical rhythm of the awl and thread, that he didn't hear her approach. "What's that?" Her voice was small, but it cut through the silence like a shard of glass. Red flinched, his hand jerking. The awl slipped, pricking his finger. A single drop of blood welled up dark against his calloused skin. He turned slowly. Bertie was standing just a few feet away, her head tilted, her gaze fixed on his chest. He'd been leaning over, and the top buttons of his shirt were undone from the heat of the work. The silver chain of the locket was visible against his skin. He hadn't realized. He never let it show. He quickly straightened up, his hand instinctively going to his chest, covering the chain. He fumbled with the buttons, his fingers suddenly clumsy. "It's nothing," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Just an old piece of metal." Bertie's eyes, the color of dark, wet earth, didn't waver. "It's shiny," she said, "like a star that fell down." He finished buttoning his shirt, the locket now safely hidden. He felt a strange panic, a wild, irrational fear that she had somehow seen through the metal, through the layers of cloth and skin, and looked upon the face hidden inside. "You shouldn't sneak up on people," he grumbled, turning back to the harness. He hoped his tone would dismiss her, send her scurrying back into the sunlight. But she didn't move. She took a tentative step closer. "My mama has a locket," she said, her voice soft. It has my papa's picture in it. She says it's so she never forgets his face. Red's hands froze over the leather strap. He kept his back to her, but he could feel her stare like a physical weight. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The words were lodged in his throat, a thick, suffocating knot. He focused on the harness, on the tiny hole he'd made with the awl, on the dark drop of his own blood that had smeared beside it. He could hear her breathing, the soft, innocent sound of it filling the vast silence of the barn. "Who's in your locket?" she asked. The question was so simple, so direct. It was a child's question, with no malice or guile behind it. But to Red, it was a battering ram against the door he'd kept locked for 15 years. He felt a tremor go through him, a deep internal shaking. He gripped the workbench, his knuckles white. He had to say something. He had to make her go away. "No one," he said, the word coming out as a choked whisper. "There's no one in it. It's empty." It was a clumsy lie, the first one that came to him. But it was all he had. He heard her take another step closer. He could smell the faint scent of sunshine and soap that clung to her. "Can I see?" she asked, her voice full of a hopeful curiosity that was almost painful to hear. "Please. I like empty things. They're full of possibilities." Red squeezed his eyes shut. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind threatening to tear him from his footing. He had spent a lifetime building a wall around his heart, a wall of silence and denial. And this small child, with her innocent questions, was dismantling it stone by stone. He had to stop her. He had to protect the hollow space inside him, the sacred, painful emptiness where the memory of the girl in the locket lived. He turned, his face a mask of cold indifference that he didn't feel. He looked down at her, his shadow falling over her small form. "I said it's nothing," he said, his voice low and hard. "Now get on out of here. This is no place for a child." Bertie flinched, as if he'd struck her. Her face, which had been so open and bright, crumpled. Her lower lip trembled. She looked from his cold eyes to the spot on his chest where the locket was hidden, then back to his face. She didn't cry, but a shadow passed over her features, a look of deep, unchildlike disappointment. She nodded slowly, a small, jerky movement. "Okay," she whispered. She turned and walked away, her small shoulders slumped. She didn't run. She walked with a strange, deliberate slowness, as if she were carrying something heavy. Red watched her go, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched until her silhouette was swallowed by the bright rectangle of the barn door, leaving him alone once more in the dusty silence. The relief he had expected to feel did not come. Instead, a wave of self-loathing washed over him, so powerful it made him dizzy. He leaned against the workbench, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had done it again. He had pushed away the very thing he yearned for. He had looked at a child and seen a ghost, and in his fear, he had wounded them both. He reached under his shirt and pulled out the locket. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold it still. He fumbled with the clasp, his fingers slick with a sudden sweat. It sprang open, and he stared down at the serious, questioning face of his daughter. Her blue eyes, so like his own, seemed to accuse him. "Who's in your locket?" Bertie's question echoed in the silent barn. "No one," he had answered. "It's empty." He sank down onto a nearby hay bale, the harness forgotten, the awl falling from his numb fingers. He stared at the tiny face, the lie he had just told a bitter taste in his mouth. The locket wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of a summer, a promise, a love that had been the only true thing in his life. It was full of a name he had buried so deep he was no longer sure he had the strength to dig it out. He brought the locket to his lips, the cool metal a shock against his skin. A sound escaped his throat, a raw, strangled noise that was half sob, half groan. It was the sound of a man breaking. And in the vast, empty barn, with only the dust motes and the ghosts to bear witness, Red Garner began to weep. The days that followed were strained. A new kind of silence grew between Red and the girl. It wasn't the comfortable distance he had maintained before. It was a taut, humming wire of unspoken things. He avoided her, more deliberately now. If he saw her in the yard, he would turn and walk the long way around the corral. If she came into the cookhouse while he was eating, he would finish his meal in hasty, joyless bites and leave. He could feel her eyes on him sometimes, a curious, wounded gaze that he refused to meet. He told himself it was for the best. He was a danger to her, a walking embodiment of a grief she was too young to understand. He had to keep her away, to protect her from the jagged edges of his own brokenness. But his actions felt cowardly, and the shame of it was a constant companion. He threw himself into his work with a desperate ferocity. He took on the hardest jobs, the ones that left him bone-weary and aching, the ones that demanded every ounce of his concentration. He spent 3 days rebuilding a section of fence on the north pasture, a remote and windswept place where the only company was the cry of the hawks and the endless sigh of the wind. He worked from sunup to sundown, his hands raw, his muscles screaming in protest. But the physical pain was a welcome distraction. It was clean and honest, unlike the tangled, messy pain that lived inside him. One evening, as he was riding back to the bunkhouse, the setting sun painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, he saw her. Birdie was sitting on the top rail of the main corral, a small, lonely figure against the vast expanse of the landscape. She wasn't looking at the sunset. She was looking at him. He couldn't avoid her this time. The path led directly past the corral. He kept his horse at a steady walk, his gaze fixed on a point between the animal's ears. He could feel her watching his approach. He steeled himself for her to speak, to ask another one of her impossible questions, but she remained silent. As he drew level with her, he chanced a quick glance. She was holding something in her hands, turning it over and over. It was a piece of wood, a small, smooth stone. He couldn't be sure. But it was the look on her face that stopped him. It was the same serious, contemplative expression as the girl in the locket. She was lost in her own world, her brow furrowed in concentration. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, the two faces merged in his mind. The living girl on the fence and the ghost girl in the silver frame. They were not the same, he knew that. Birdie's hair was dark, her eyes brown. But the essence of them, the quiet intensity, the old soul quality in their gaze, was unnervingly similar. The realization shook him. He pulled his horse to a halt, the animal sensing his sudden tension. He didn't know what to say. The apology he owed her felt too large and complicated for words. She looked up, startled by his sudden stop. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of the fear he had put there a few days before, but it was quickly replaced by that relentless curiosity. She held up the object in her hand. It was a small, flat stone, worn smooth by the river. On its surface, she had drawn a face with a piece of charcoal, 2 dots for eyes, a line for a mouth. It was crude, a child's drawing, but it was unmistakable. "I'm making him a friend," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "so he won't be lonely." Red followed her gaze. She was looking at old Satan, the foreman's notoriously ill-tempered stallion, who was standing alone in the far corner of the corral, his head bowed. The other horses gave him a wide berth. He was a magnificent animal, powerful and proud, but there was a deep sadness in him, a loneliness that even a child could see. Red looked from the horse to the girl to the small, smiling face drawn on the stone. A lump formed in his throat. She wasn't just a whirlwind of questions. She was a mender, like him. She saw the broken, lonely things and felt a need to fix them. She saw the sadness in a horse and offered it the companionship of a painted rock. She had seen the sadness in him, too. She had seen the locket and understood it was a vessel for a memory. Her question, "Who's in your locket?" hadn't been an intrusion. It had been an offering, an invitation to share a burden, an invitation he had thrown back in her face. He swung himself down from the saddle, his movements stiff. He walked to the fence, the dust puffing up around his boots. He stopped a few feet from her, his hands resting on the top rail. He still couldn't look at her directly. He looked at the horse. "He's a mean one," Red said, his voice quiet. "Kicked a man last year. Broke his leg in 2 places." Birdie nodded, her eyes still on the stallion. "Mama says people are mean when they're sad," she said, "or scared." Red felt the truth of her words like a punch to the gut. He thought of his own meanness to her in the barn. He had been scared, terrified. He cleared his throat. "That stone. It's a good likeness." A small smile touched her lips, the first he had ever seen directed at him. "He needs a name," she said. "The Friend." Red considered this for a moment. He looked at the solitary horse, then at the small stone in her hand. "How about Anchor?" he suggested. "Something to hold him steady." Birdie's face lit up. "Anchor," she repeated, testing the word. She nodded decisively. "Yes, that's a good name, a strong name." She carefully placed the stone on the fence post beside her, positioning it so the charcoal face was looking towards the stallion. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Now, he's not alone." They stood there in silence for a long time, the man and the child, watching the sad horse and the stone friend. The sun had dipped below the mountains, and the world was bathed in a soft gray twilight. The anger and the fear in Red had subsided, replaced by a quiet, aching sorrow. He had spent 15 years believing that his grief was a private, sacred thing, a burden no one else could ever understand or share. He had built his walls so high and so thick that he had forgotten that on the other side, people were still living, still loving, still finding ways to mend the broken things, even if it was just with a painted stone. He finally found the courage to look at her. Her face was smudged with charcoal, and a piece of hay was stuck in her tangled curls. She was just a little girl, full of a strange and wonderful wisdom. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "For the other day, in the barn. I was wrong to speak to you that way." Birdie looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She didn't offer him easy forgiveness. She just nodded slowly, accepting his apology as a simple fact. "It's okay," she said. "Sometimes grown-ups forget their manners too." Red felt a ghost of a smile touch his own lips. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a bird he had whittled from a piece of cottonwood bark. He'd been working on it at night, a secret project to soothe his own guilt. The carving was rough, but the shape was unmistakable. He held it out to her. "For you," he said. Her eyes widened. She took the bird from his calloused palm, her small fingers tracing the lines of the wings. "It's beautiful," she whispered, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on her face. "Thank you." He just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He felt a loosening in his chest, a small crack in the ice that had encased his heart for so long. It was a start, a small, fragile beginning. Like a newly mended fence, it might not hold against a storm, but for now, it was straight and true. He turned to leave, to take his horse to the barn. "Red?" Her voice stopped him. He turned back. She was still holding the wooden bird, clutching it to her chest. "Is your locket still empty?" she asked, her voice soft and hesitant, as if she were afraid of breaking the fragile truce between them. Red looked at her, at this strange, persistent child who saw too much. The lie was on the tip of his tongue, the easy denial that had been his shield for so long. But he couldn't say it. Not to her. Not now. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's not empty." He didn't offer more and she didn't ask, but it was enough. It was a truth, small and incomplete, but a truth nonetheless. And as he walked away into the deepening twilight, he felt the locket against his chest, not as a burden, but as a quiet, steady weight, like an anchor. That small admission changed something. The taut wire between them slackened into a thread of cautious friendship. Bertie no longer followed him with a barrage of questions, but with a quiet companionship. She would sit on a hay bale in the barn while he worked, humming to herself and carving her own menagerie of small animals from scraps of wood he gave her. She learned the language of his silence, understanding when he needed to be lost in his thoughts, and when he was open to a soft-spoken observation about the way a spider spun its web or the color of a horse's eye. Red, in turn, found himself slowly letting her in. He started talking to her, not about anything important, but about the small, simple things that made up his world. He taught her the names of the different tools, showed her how to tell a horse's age by its teeth, and pointed out the constellations in the vast, star-dusted sky at night. He found a strange comfort in her presence. She didn't ask for the stories he couldn't tell. She just accepted him as he was. A quiet man who was good with his hands and knew the names of the stars. One afternoon they were tasked with rebuilding a section of the corral fence that had been damaged by a spooked herd. It was slow, hard work under the hot sun. Red was setting a new post, digging the hole deep and wide, his muscles straining with each shovelful of earth. Bertie was in charge of handing him the tools, a job she took with the utmost seriousness. She sat in the shade of the barn, her small collection of wooden animals arranged in a neat row beside her. He was tamping the earth around the base of the post when he felt a sharp, searing pain in his back. He cried out, dropping the tamper, his hand flying to the spot. A muscle had seized, a knot of pure agony that took his breath away. He stumbled back, leaning against the new post, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Red!" Bertie was at his side in an instant, her face etched with alarm. "Are you okay? What happened?" He couldn't speak, could only gasp for air as the muscle spasmed again. He gritted his teeth, trying to breathe through the pain. "It's my back," he finally managed to say. Just a cramp." But it was more than a cramp. It was an old injury, a weakness that would flare up without warning, a reminder of a time when his body had been pushed beyond its limits. Bertie looked helpless. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Go get Elias," he gritted out. "The foreman. Tell him my back's gone out." She nodded, her eyes wide, and took off at a run towards the main house, her small legs pumping furiously. Red slid down the post until he was sitting on the ground, his back pressed against the rough wood. The pain was a living thing, a hot fire spreading across his lower back. He closed his eyes, his breath coming in shallow pants. He hated this. He hated the weakness, the helplessness. He hated being a burden. He heard footsteps approaching, not the heavy tread of the foreman, but the lighter, quicker steps of the girl. He opened his eyes. Bertie was back, her face flushed from running. She was carrying a canteen of water. "Elias is coming," she said, her voice breathless. She knelt beside him and unscrewed the cap of the canteen. "Here," she said, holding it to his lips. "Mama says water helps." He took a few sips, the cool liquid a small comfort. He leaned his head back against the post, exhausted. The pain was beginning to subside into a dull, throbbing ache. He felt a small, gentle touch on his forehead. Bertie was wiping the sweat from his brow with the sleeve of her dress. Her touch was hesitant, but incredibly soft. It was a gesture of such simple, uncomplicated kindness that it caught him completely off guard. He hadn't been touched like that, with such tenderness, in more years than he could count. A wave of emotion washed over him, so powerful it almost eclipsed the physical pain. He thought of another pair of small hands, another gentle touch. He thought of a feverish brow and a cool cloth. The memory was so vivid, so sudden, that he flinched. "Did I hurt you?" Bertie asked, snatching her hand back as if she'd been burned. "No," he said quickly, his voice thick. "No, child, you didn't hurt me." He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the genuine concern in her dark eyes, the worry that puckered her brow. He saw the goodness in her, a pure, unwavering light. And in that moment, He knew he couldn't keep the walls up any longer. Not with her. She deserved more than his silence and his half-truths. The foreman arrived a few minutes later, and with the help of another hand, they managed to get Red back to the bunkhouse. They laid him on his cot, and the foreman's sister, Clara, came with a poultice of mustard and herbs that smelled foul, but brought a blessed, spreading warmth to his aching back. He was told to rest for a few days, an order that chafed at his pride, but one he was in too much pain to disobey. The other hands came and went, offering gruff words of sympathy and leaving him to his misery. But Bertie stayed. She pulled up a small stool and sat by his cot, a silent, watchful guardian. She didn't say much, just worked on her carvings, the soft scrape of her knife against the wood, a soothing, rhythmic sound in the quiet room. That evening, after the other men had gone to the cookhouse for supper, the bunkhouse was empty except for the two of them. The setting sun filled the room with a warm, golden light. Red was lying on his side, the pain in his back now a manageable ache. Bertie had put aside her carving and was just watching him, her chin resting in her hands. "You have a scar," she said softly. Red tensed. He was lying with his back to her, but she must have seen it when they were helping him onto the cot. It was on his side, a long, jagged line that ran from his ribs to his hip, a relic from a long-ago fight with a wild horse and a tangle of barbed wire. But he knew that wasn't the scar she meant. She had seen the other one, the one over his heart. He had been so consumed by the pain in his back, he hadn't thought to hide it. He didn't answer. He hoped she would let it go. But she was a bloodhound for the truth. "It's a funny shape," she continued, her voice thoughtful. "Like a little smile, or a cradle." He squeezed his eyes shut. A cradle. He had always thought the same thing. He rolled over slowly, carefully, wincing as the muscles in his back protested. He faced her. He had to face her. He sat up, leaning against the wall, and unbuttoned the top of his shirt. He didn't have to pull it aside. The scar was there, a pale, silvery crescent against the weathered skin of his chest. He looked down at it, then up at her. Her eyes were fixed on the mark, her expression one of intense concentration. "How did you get it?" she asked, her voice a whisper. This was it. The precipice. He could lie. He could invent a story about a stray bullet or a fall from a horse. It would be so easy. It was what he had always done. But he looked at her face, so open and trusting, and he couldn't do it. The lie felt like a betrayal, not just of his own past, but of her. He owed her the truth, or at least a piece of it. "It wasn't a fight," he said, his voice low and raspy. "It was a fire." He paused, the memory rising up like smoke choking him. He had to force the words out. "There was a fire. A long time ago, I was trying to get someone out." Bertie's eyes widened. "Did you save them?" she asked, her voice full of breathless hope. Red looked away, his gaze falling on the worn floorboards. He stared at them until the lines of the wood blurred together. He felt the locket, a cold weight against his chest, a constant reminder of his failure. "No," he whispered, the word a shard of glass in his throat. "No, I didn't." The silence that followed was profound. It was filled with the weight of the unspoken, the tragedy he had only hinted at. Bertie didn't press for more details. She seemed to understand that he had given her all he could. She reached out a small hand and with a feather-light touch, traced the outline of the scar on his chest. Her finger was warm against his skin. "It's the shape of a cradle," she said again, her voice soft, with a wisdom beyond her years. Maybe it's not a scar for what you lost. Maybe it's a place to hold them." Red stared at her, his heart aching with a pain that had nothing to do with the muscles in his back. A place to hold them. He had never thought of it that way. He had always seen the scar as a mark of his failure, a brand of his loss. But she saw it as a vessel, a place of remembrance, just like she saw the locket. He reached up and pulled the chain from under his shirt. The silver oval lay in his palm, gleaming in the fading light. He looked at it, then at her. He knew what he had to do. His hand was trembling, but his resolve was firm. With a deep, shuddering breath, he held it out to her. Her name was Lily, he said. The name. He had said her name. After 15 years of silence, the word felt strange and foreign on his tongue, but also profoundly right. It was like unlocking a door and letting in a sliver of light. Bertie's eyes were wide, her gaze fixed on the locket. She didn't take it. She just looked at him, waiting. He understood. With his thumb, he pressed the worn clasp. The locket sprang open. He turned it so she could see. The serious, beautiful face of his daughter, his Lily, looked out at them in the golden twilight. Bertie leaned in, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at the picture for a long time, her expression unreadable. She looked from the face in the locket to Red's face, then back again. "She has your eyes," she whispered. Red nodded, unable to speak. A single tear escaped from the corner of his eye and traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. Bertie reached out and gently closed his fingers around the locket. Her hand was warm and steady. "Thank you for showing me," she said, her voice full of a quiet reverence. "She's beautiful." She sat back on her stool, and they remained in silence as the room darkened around them. The pain in Red's back was still there, a dull, persistent ache, but for the first time in 15 years, the pain in his heart felt a little less lonely. He had shared his ghost, and she hadn't run away. The confession, as small as it was, settled something in Red. The telling of Lily's name, the sharing of her face, had not brought the world crashing down, as he had always feared it would. It had been like lancing a wound. Painful, yes, but followed by a clean, quiet relief. A space had been cleared. He began to talk to Bertie about Lily, not in a flood of memories, but in small, hesitant drops. He told her how Lily had loved the smell of rain on dry earth, how she would collect pebbles and call them her treasures, how she had a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. Each memory was a stone he pulled from the wall inside him, and with each one, the light grew a little brighter. Bertie listened with a solemn grace, never pushing for more than he was willing to give. She was a keeper of his secrets, a small, steady anchor in the turbulent sea of his grief. His back slowly healed, and he returned to his work, but something had shifted. The other hands noticed it. The hard, impenetrable shell around him had softened. He would still go for long periods without speaking, but the silence was different now. It was less a wall and more a quiet space, one that felt less lonely. He even found himself joining in the conversations around the fire sometimes, offering a quiet observation or a dry, unexpected joke that would surprise the men into laughter. One day, Elias Thorne sought him out. The foreman was a practical man, not given to sentiment, but he had a keen eye. He found Red in the barn, mending a saddle blanket. "My sister tells me you've taken a shine to the girl," Elias said, leaning against a post and chewing on a piece of straw. Red didn't stop his work. "She's a good kid," he said, his voice even. "Doesn't miss much." Elias grunted in agreement. "She's taken a shine to you, too. You're all she talks about. Red this, Red that." He paused, spitting the straw onto the floor. "I've been meaning to fix the beam in here, the main support. It's got a crack in it that's been worrying me." Red looked up at the massive central beam that supported the hayloft. It was an old, seasoned piece of timber, as thick as a man's chest. He could see the dark line of the fracture from where he sat. "It's a big job," Red said. "Need to brace the loft first." "I know," Elias said. "That's why I'm asking you. I want it done right. And I was thinking, the girl could help you, keep her out of her mother's hair for a few days. She's good at fetching things." Red looked at the foreman. It was more than just a request for a repair. It was a vote of confidence, an acknowledgement of the bond he had formed with the child. "All right," Red said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "We'll start tomorrow." The next morning, the barn was transformed into a workshop. Red, with the help of two other hands, constructed a sturdy set of braces to support the weight of the hayloft. Then, the real work began. The old beam had to be carefully removed. It was a slow, arduous process. Red worked with a focused intensity, his movements precise and economical. Birdie was his shadow, his apprentice. She handed him tools, held the lantern steady when he needed to see into the dark crevices of the joinery, and kept a careful inventory of the nails and pegs they removed. She was fascinated by the process, by the way the old barn was constructed, the intricate puzzle of mortise and tenon joints. As they worked, Red would explain what he was doing, his voice a low murmur in the quiet space. He spoke of the different types of wood, the way the grain told a story of the tree's life, its seasons of drought and plenty. He was teaching her more than carpentry. He was teaching her his own philosophy, the one he had lived by for so long, that anything broken could be mended if you had the patience and the skill. That strength came not from being unbreakable, but from being well repaired. On the third day, they finally managed to lower the massive beam to the barn floor. It landed with a deep, resonant thud that shook the entire structure. It was riddled with termite damage and dry rot, far worse than Red had suspected. It was a wonder it hadn't given way sooner. "We'll have to replace the whole thing," Red said, running his hand over the crumbling wood. "No saving this one." As he inspected the damage, his fingers brushed against something embedded in the wood, near one of the ends. It was a small metal tin, rusted and wedged deep into a cavity. His curiosity piqued. He took his knife and carefully began to pry it loose. Birdie watched, her eyes wide. "What is it?" she whispered. "I don't know," Red said, his brow furrowed in concentration. The tin was stuck fast. He had to chip away at the rotten wood around it. Finally, with a soft crack, it came free. It was a small, rectangular tobacco tin, the paint long since peeled away. It was surprisingly heavy. He shook it. Something rattled inside. With Birdie looking over his shoulder, he worked the lid open. It was rusted shut, but with a final, determined effort, it gave way with a groan. Inside, nestled in a bed of what looked like dried leaves, was a small, leather-bound journal and a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, the same color as the ribbon in Lily's hair. Red's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the contents of the tin, a cold dread washing over him. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, what this was. He reached in with a trembling hand and picked up the bundle of letters. The paper was brittle with age. The top envelope was addressed in a familiar, elegant script. To Elias Thorne, from his sister Clara. Red's blood ran cold. He looked at Birdie, but she was staring at the journal, her small hand reaching for it. "Don't," he said, his voice sharp. She drew her hand back, startled. He took the journal from the tin. The leather was dry and cracked. There was no name on the cover. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was different. It was a man's hand, strong and sure. The first entry was dated 16 years ago, June 10th. Arrived at Rattlestone today. The foreman, Thorne, seems a decent man. The work is hard but honest. It's a good place to disappear. Red's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew that handwriting. He knew it as well as his own. It belonged to the man who had worked on this ranch before him, the man who had slept in the corner cot before he had, the man who had left without a word one spring morning, leaving behind nothing but a few worn-out tools and a ghost. His name was Daniel, and he had been Lily's father. No, not her father. That wasn't right. Red was her father. He had been the one there. He had held her, loved her. Daniel had just been the man who had given her his eyes, the man who had broken her mother's heart and run away. Red felt a surge of the old bitterness, the old anger. He had spent 15 years hating this man, this ghost, and now here was his story, unearthed from the heart of the barn. He looked at the letters again, at Clara's name. Clara, the foreman's sister, Birdie's mother. The pieces began to click into place. forming a picture he didn't want to see. He looked at Bertie, who was watching him with a confused and worried expression. He had to get her out of there. He couldn't let her see this, not yet. "Bertie," he said, his voice strained, "go to the cookhouse. Tell them we'll be ready for the new beam this afternoon, and bring me back some water." She hesitated, her gaze flickering from his face to the tin. She knew something was wrong, but she was an obedient child. She nodded and left, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent barn. As soon as she was gone, Red sank to the floor, his back against the fallen beam. He untied the ribbon on the letters, his fingers fumbling. He pulled one from its envelope. It was from Clara to her brother, Elias. The date was from 15 years ago. "Dearest Elias," it began, "I am writing to you in desperation. Daniel has left. He just disappeared one morning without a word. I don't know where he has gone. I am with child, Elias, his child. I have nowhere to turn. Our parents will disown me. I am so scared." Red's hands were shaking so badly he could barely read the words. He grabbed another letter. This one was from Daniel, tucked into the same envelope. It was a short, frantic note. "Thorne, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. I can't be a father. I don't have it in me. I'm no good. Tell Clara I'm sorry. Tell her to forget me. It's better this way." Red felt a wave of nausea. He had been so wrong. He had crafted a story in his mind, a story of betrayal and abandonment, with himself as the wronged hero who had stepped in to save the day. But the truth was so much messier, so much more pathetic. Daniel hadn't abandoned them out of malice. He had run away out of fear, out of a sense of his own inadequacy, a feeling Red knew all too well. He picked up the journal. He had to know the rest. He turned the pages, his eyes scanning the entries. Daniel wrote of his love for Clara, a love that was fierce and passionate, but also shadowed by his own demons. He wrote of his fear of being tied down, his terror at the prospect of fatherhood. And then he wrote about the fire. Red's hands went cold. He read the entry, his heart pounding. September 4th. The fire. It came so fast. I tried to get to them. I swear I tried. The smoke was so thick, I couldn't breathe. I heard Clara screaming my name, and then nothing. I woke up outside. Someone had pulled me out. But the house, it was gone. They were gone. Clara and the baby, my baby. Red stopped reading. He couldn't breathe. It was all a lie. The story he had told himself. The story he had told Bertie. It was all wrong. He hadn't been the one who had tried to save them. He had been the one who had been saved. He had been working in the fields that day. He remembered the smoke, the chaos. He remembered running towards the flames, but the details were hazy, lost in the trauma of the event. He had always assumed Daniel had run before the fire, but he hadn't. He had been there. He had tried. Red felt the world tilting on its axis. His entire identity, the one he had so carefully constructed for 15 years, was built on a foundation of lies. He wasn't the grieving father. He was just the man who had loved the mother of another man's child. He had found the locket in the ashes of the cabin, the only thing left of them, and he had taken it. He had taken her picture, her name, her story, and made it his own. He had become a father in his own mind, because the truth was too painful to bear, that he was no one, just a lonely ranch hand who had lost the only woman he had ever loved. A profound, soul-crushing shame washed over him. He thought of Bertie. He had looked into her innocent face and fed her a story that was not his to tell. He had used his grief, a grief that wasn't even rightfully his, to forge a bond with her. What would she think of him if she knew the truth? That he was a fraud, a thief of memories. He heard her footsteps returning. He quickly stuffed the journal and the letters back into the tin and shoved it deep into a pile of old burlap sacks in the corner. He couldn't let her see it. He couldn't let anyone see it. He had to protect the lie. It was all he had left. When Bertie returned with the water, she found him standing by the new beam, his face pale and drawn. He took the canteen from her and drank deeply, his eyes avoiding hers. He was different. The fragile peace between them was gone, replaced by the old, familiar tension. He was distant again, his words clipped, his movements brusque. Bertie didn't understand. One moment they were partners, rebuilding the heart of the barn together. The next, he was a stranger again, the walls back up, higher and thicker than ever before. The work on the beam continued, but the joy had gone out of it. It was just a job now, a task to be completed. Red worked with a grim, silent determination, and Bertie felt like an intruder in his world once more. She tried to talk to him, to ask him what was wrong, but he would just shake his head and turn away. The discovery in the old beam had changed him. It had reawakened the ghosts he had just begun to lay to rest, but these were new ghosts, more complicated and more terrible than the ones he had lived with before. They were the ghosts of his own deceit. A few nights later, unable to sleep, Red found himself walking the grounds of the ranch. The moon was full, casting a stark, silvery light over the landscape. He was drawn, as if by an invisible string, to the place where the old cabin had stood. It was just a clearing now, a scar on the land that had never fully healed. The grass grew thin and patchy, and the earth was still dark with soot if you dug down a few inches. He stood at the edge of the clearing, the memories washing over him. He remembered Clara's laughter. He remembered the way she looked at him, a look that made him feel like he could build a whole world for her with his bare hands. He remembered the day she had told him she was carrying Daniel's child. He had been devastated, but he had hidden it. He had sworn to her that he would stay, that he would help her, that he would be a friend to her and a father to her child if Daniel never came back. It was a promise he had been ready to keep. He had loved her enough to raise another man's child as his own, and then the fire had taken everything. He sank to his knees in the cool, damp earth. He pulled the locket from his shirt. The face of the little girl stared up at him, her expression unchanging, her blue eyes full of a silent question. Lily. He had named her Lily. Clara had talked about names, but they had never settled on one. He had chosen it himself, after the fire. He had created a whole life for her in his mind, a life that had never been. He had stolen her from the ashes and made her his own personal saint, his own private sorrow. He was a grave robber, a thief of ghosts. A sob escaped his throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure self-hatred. He had to end this. He had to let her go. He couldn't carry this lie anymore. It was poisoning everything, even the fragile connection he had forged with Bertie. He stood up, his resolve hardening. He walked to the center of the clearing, to the spot where the hearth had been. With his bare hands, he began to dig. The earth was soft. He dug until his fingers were raw, until he had made a small, shallow hole. He held the locket over it, the silver chain pooling in his palm. He had to bury it. He had to bury the lie and the girl and the life he had invented. He had to let her rest. He had to set himself free. His hand trembled. He closed his eyes, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He thought of Bertie. He thought of her tracing the scar on his chest, her words echoing in his mind. Maybe it's a place to hold them. He had shown her the locket. He had told her Lily's name. He had shared his most sacred secret with her. And now he was going to bury it, to pretend it had never happened. It would be another lie, another betrayal. He couldn't do it. He opened his eyes. He couldn't bury her. He couldn't erase her. The love he felt for her, the grief, it was real. It didn't matter that she wasn't his by blood. He had loved her. He had mourned her. That was a truth that no journal or letter could ever change. He was her father. In his heart, where it mattered, he was her father. He pulled his hand back, clutching the locket tight. He would not bury her, but he could not keep living the lie. There had to be another way, a way to honor the truth, all of it, the truth of his love for Clara, the truth of Daniel's fear, the truth of the child they had both lost, and the truth of the child who was still living. Bertie. He stood up and walked back to the barn, his mind racing. He went to the corner where he had hidden the tin. He pulled it out and took out the journal and the letters. He sat down in the spot where he and Bertie had worked together, the new beam solid and strong above him. He had to read it all. He had to understand. He spent the rest of the night in the silent barn, piecing together the story of the people whose lives had been so tragically intertwined with his own. He read of Clara's quiet desperation, her love for a man who was too broken to love her back. He read of Daniel's self-loathing, his conviction that he would only bring ruin to those he cared for. It was a story of fear and regret, of missed chances and unspoken words. It was a human story, a story not so different from his own. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the barn walls, he came to the last entry in Daniel's journal. It was written in a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. September 5th. I'm leaving. I can't stay here. Every face I see is an accusation. Thorne knows. He knows I was a coward. He pulled me from the fire, but he looked at me with such contempt. I saw the locket in his hand. He found it in the ashes. He thinks I don't deserve to even look at her face. He's right. I'm leaving it with him. He can give it to Clara's people, or throw it in a river. I don't care. Nothing matters anymore. My only regret is the child. The child who will never know her father was a coward who ran from a fire instead of dying in it. Red stared at the words, his mind reeling. Elias. Elias had been there. He had pulled Daniel from the fire, and he had found the locket, but he hadn't given it to Daniel. He had kept it. Why? Why would he keep it, only to leave it on the cot for Red to find when he took Daniel's place? It didn't make sense. Unless Elias hadn't known who the locket belonged to. Or unless he had known, and he had left it there for a reason. A test. A burden to be passed on. Red's head was spinning. The story was so much bigger and more complicated than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just his story, or Daniel's, or Clara's. It was Elias's story too. And now, it was Bertie's. She was at the center of it all, the living, breathing legacy of all this pain and regret. She deserved to know the truth. Not his version of it, not Daniel's version of it, but the whole, messy, complicated truth. And he was the only one who could give it to her. But how? How could he tell a child that her whole life was built on a foundation of secrets and lies? That the man she called father was a picture in a locket her mother kept, but that her real father was a ghost who had haunted this very ranch. And that the man she had come to trust, the man who had shown her the locket, was a fraud who had stolen another man's grief. The weight of it was crushing. He felt the old fear returning, the urge to run, to disappear, just as Daniel had. But he looked up at the new beam, the one he and Bertie had set together. It was strong. It was true. It was a testament to the fact that broken things could be mended. He had to be strong too. He had to be true. For her. He made a decision. He would not tell her. Not yet. He would tell Elias. He would go to the foreman and lay the whole story at his feet. The journal, the letters, the locket. He would confess his own lies, his own deceptions. He would put the truth in Elias's hands, and together they would decide how to tell the child. It was the only way. He stood up, his body aching with exhaustion, but his mind clear for the first time in years. He put the journal and the letters back in the tin. He took one last look at the locket, at the face of the girl he had called his own for so long. He whispered her name one last time. Lily. Then he closed the locket and tucked it away. He walked out of the barn and into the morning light, the tin can heavy in his hand, ready to face the truth, whatever the cost. He found Elias by the corral, drinking his morning coffee. The foreman looked at him, his eyes narrowed. You look like you've been through a war, he said. Red didn't answer. He just held out the tin. We need to talk, he said, his voice steady. It's about your sister, and Daniel, and the girl. Elias's face went pale. He took the tin from Red's hand, his own hand trembling slightly. He looked from the tin to Red's face, a dawning horror in his eyes. He knew. He had always known. He just hadn't known that Red knew, too. He nodded slowly. "All right, Garner," he said, his voice a low growl. "Let's talk." They went to the main house, to Elias's small, cluttered office. The foreman closed the door, a look of grim finality on his face. He placed the tin on his desk but didn't open it. He just stared at it, as if it were a coiled snake. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice tight. "In the old beam," Red said, "the one we replaced." Elias nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I put it there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "After Daniel left. I didn't know what else to do with it. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it, and I couldn't bring myself to read it. I just hid it. I guess I was hoping it would just disappear, that the past would stay buried." He looked up at Red, his eyes full of a pain that mirrored Red's own. "He was a good man, Daniel. Just lost. He loved my sister, but he was terrified. He thought he was poison, that he would destroy everything he touched." "He was there," Red said quietly, "at the fire." Elias's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. "You know about that?" Red nodded. "It's in the journal. He tried to save them." Elias sank into his chair, his face crumbling. He buried his face in his hands. "I know," he said, his voice muffled. "I was the one who pulled him out. He was unconscious. I thought he'd run, that he'd set the fire and run. I was so angry. I told him to leave, to never come back. I told him he was a coward." He looked up at Red, his eyes swimming with tears. "I didn't know he'd tried to go back in. I didn't know until I found the journal a few days later. By then he was long gone." The two men sat in silence, the weight of 15 years of secrets and misunderstandings pressing down on them. "The locket," Red said finally. "You found it." Elias nodded. "In the ashes. I didn't know what it was at first. I took it back to the bunkhouse. I was going to give it to Daniel, but I couldn't. I was too angry. I left it on his cot. A few days later, he was gone, and you were there. You'd taken his place, and you had the locket." He looked at Red, a question in his eyes. "I never understood. Why did you keep it? Why did you let me think? Why did you let everyone think you were her father?" Red looked down at his hands. He owed this man the truth, all of it. "Because I loved your sister," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And when she was gone, the locket, the girl, it was all I had left of her. It was a lie. I know that. But it was a lie that kept me alive." Elias stared at him, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be seeing Red for the first time. He reached out and opened the tin. He took out the journal and the letters, his hands gentle. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked back at Red. "We have made a mess of things, you and I," he said, his voice full of a weary sadness. "We let our grief and our anger blind us. And now there is a child who has to live with the consequences." "What do we do?" Red asked, the question a plea. "How do we tell her?" Elias was silent for a long time. He picked up the locket and opened it, staring at the face of the child he had never known. "My sister, Clara, she sent me a letter a few months after the fire," he said, his voice distant. "She hadn't been in the cabin. She had gone to town that day to see a doctor. The baby was coming early. She came back to nothing." Red's heart stopped. "She's alive," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Clara's alive." Elias shook his head slowly, his eyes full of a fresh pain. "No," he said. "She died, a week later. The fever took her. But the baby lived." Red stared at him, his mind refusing to comprehend the words. The baby lived. A girl. A small, premature baby girl who had lost her mother a week after she was born. A girl who had been raised by her uncle on a remote ranch in Montana. A girl with a tangle of dark curls and eyes that missed nothing. "Birdie," Red breathed, the name a revelation, a prayer. Elias nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "Her name isn't Birdie," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I called her that because she was so small, so fragile. I didn't think she would make it, but she did. She's a fighter, just like her mother." He looked at Red, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Her real name, the name Clara gave her before she died. It's Lily." The world tilted and then fell away. Red felt the floor beneath him disappear, the air in his lungs turn to fire. Lily, Birdie was Lily, the girl in the locket, and the girl who had sat by his bed, who had mended the fence with him, who had asked him about his scars. They were one and the same. It was impossible. It was a miracle. It was a wound torn open, and a prayer answered all at once. He stared at Elias, his mind a maelstrom of shock and disbelief and a wild, soaring hope that was so powerful it threatened to tear him apart. But her eyes," he stammered. "Her hair, they're different." "She takes after Daniel's mother," Elias said, his voice soft. "I have a picture. But her spirit is all Clara." He pushed the journal across the desk towards Red. "It's all in there. In the last letters Clara wrote me. I couldn't bear to read them again. I couldn't bear to face what I had done. I let Daniel think his child was dead. I let you think the child you loved was a ghost. I was a coward. I hid the truth because I couldn't face my own part in the tragedy." Red was speechless. He looked from the foreman's tormented face to the tin can that held the truth of all their lives. He thought of Birdie, Lily, and her uncanny wisdom, her immediate connection to the locket, her fascination with his scars. It was as if some part of her soul knew. She had been circling the truth of her own life, drawn to the man who carried her memory around his neck. The door to the office creaked open. They both looked up. Birdie, Lily, was standing there, a worried frown on her face. "Mama said you were in here," she said, looking from her uncle's tear-streaked face to Red's stunned expression. "Is everything okay?" She saw the open tin on the desk, the letters, the journal. Her eyes widened. She walked slowly into the room, her gaze fixed on the objects. She looked at Red, and in her dark, serious eyes, he saw the question she had asked him in the barn so long ago. "Who's in your locket?" Now he had the answer. The real answer. This was the moment, the climax of all the years of silence and lies. He could stay quiet. He could let Elias handle it. He could retreat back into the shadows and let the truth unfold without him. It would be the safe thing to do, the easy thing to do. But he looked at her face, this child who was both a ghost and a miracle, this living embodiment of the love and the loss that had defined his life. He had denied her once, in a way. He had denied her father, her story. He could not deny her again. He had to claim her. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as the living, breathing girl who stood before him. He had to give her back her name. He stood up, his legs unsteady. He walked around the desk and knelt before her, so they were at eye level. He took her small hands in his. They were warm and real. He looked into her eyes, the eyes of Daniel's mother, but the soul of Clara. He saw his own grief reflected there, and his own hope. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He had to say it. He had to speak the truth that had been buried for so long. He had to give her back to herself. He finally said her name, and the wind didn't take it.